The earliest memories Jackson could still trust were stained with engine grease and the smell of cracked vinyl seats under the summer sun. He grew up behind fences, near airfields where boys like him were never invited past the gate. His father, an aircraft mechanic who worked for next to nothing at a regional hangar, used to sneak him into old hangars after hours, not for thrill but for learning. While other kids played ball in the streets, Jackson sat cross-legged beside grounded planes, listening to the tick of cooling turbines and his father's voice telling stories not from books, but from bolts and blueprints. In those silent hours between engines, something unshakable took root in him. Not just a love for flight, but a hunger to rise. Their house was a cramped two-bedroom rental wedged between factories and scrapyards on the edge of Tulsa. The walls were thin, and the windows were cracked, but the sky above was endless. Jackson would press his forehead to the glass on restless nights and count the planes flashing across the black canvas, not with envy, but determination. He didn't want to be a passenger. He wanted control. But the world was built to deny men like him that kind of access. By the time he turned 17, life had already buried most of his peers in dead-end jobs, juvenile records, or worse. But Jackson had a plan. He enlisted not out of patriotism but strategy. The Air Force didn't care about money, only discipline. He gave them both. And in return, he got access to knowledge, to flight simulators, to the kind of training no civilian school could offer. He rose quickly not because of charm, but because of precision. He studied aircraft the way surgeons study veins. Every hydraulic line, every emergency protocol, every nuance of atmospheric pressure and lift ratio. It lived inside his skull like scripture. And when he finally gripped the yoke of his first jet during a night exercise over Nevada, the stars above him seemed less distant. But even the military has ceilings. His superior officers admired his performance, but promotions slowed. He heard the quiet reasons. A man with his skin, his face, his manner, better as support staff, one commander suggested. Jackson didn't argue. He just prepared. He saved every cent, spent leaves studying finance instead of resting, read business strategy instead of drinking. By the time he left service, he wasn't looking for work. He was looking for leverage. Civilian life hit harder than expected. His resume was decorated with flight hours, leadership credentials, and certifications, but his interviews always ended the same. Smiles, nods, and subtle brush-offs. He once walked into a corporate hangar to interview as a fleet manager and was mistaken for the janitor, twice. So he stopped knocking on doors and started drafting blueprints. He found work repairing turbines at a second-rate repair bay outside Phoenix. It was grueling, hot, and thankless, but it gave him proximity. While colleagues joked about failed ventures or hungover nights, Jackson listened. He watched supply chains, measured demand cycles, tracked aircraft downtime, and mapped gaps in the industry. Then, quietly, he began investing. Small at first, shared ownership in cargo charters, then pre-owned prop planes. Every dollar went back into growth. He didn't buy clothes. He didn't eat out. He lived like a monk with a flight obsession. He learned licensing, compliance, federal registration. He studied the tax codes for aircraft ownership and spent 3 sleepless weeks negotiating a deal that gave him 10% equity in a startup air logistics firm. Equity he'd later buy out when the market dipped. He flew cargo on weekends, brokered hangar space on weekdays, and cold-called business owners by night. Each no added a notch to his fire. His first major break came not from luck, but a delayed flight. A billionaire tech CEO, grounded for 6 hours, watched Jackson defuse a critical avionics failure on a Learjet in 30 minutes flat. The CEO didn't thank him. But 3 months later, when that same CEO needed to offload a half-finished air logistics project during a downturn, Jackson's name came up. And he was ready, with a signed term sheet and a line of private funding from a veteran angel investor he met at a war memorial fundraiser. In 4 years, Jackson turned that half-failed operation into a streamlined, cross-state luxury air service for high-value clients, medical emergencies, confidential packages, precision cargo. His pilots were ex-military. His maintenance team was built from the ground up. He kept everything lean, sharp, and silent. No media, no flash. But he didn't stop. He attended one auction in Zurich where a Gulfstream jet, sleek, unclaimed, underappreciated, was being undersold. The specs were solid. It needed work. But Jackson had always trusted machines more than people. He bought it, rebuilt it, personalized every panel, registered it under his name. Not a holding company, not a shell trust. Jackson A. King. And when the custom tail number was approved, he chose to do what most men in his position never dared. He put his name in gold letters under the tail. Not for vanity, for clarity. So the next time someone looked at him with raised eyebrows or tried to wave him off a tarmac with that old look of disbelief, the answer would already be there, glinting in sunlight and steel. This jet doesn't need an introduction. It has his name. And the runway he was once barred from? Now it's waiting for him to arrive. The morning began like any other on the edge of wealth. The private executive airfield was dressed in all its usual silence and sterile polish, glass facades glinting with reflections of jets, polished chrome SUVs rolling up to velvet curtain lobbies, and attendants trained to smile only at the properly dressed. Every interaction was measured, filtered through a hierarchy written in shoes, suits, surnames, and subtle glances. This was not a place for questions, it was a place for expectation, for seamless transition from ground to sky, reserved for those who were expected to own the skies. So when Jackson arrived, everything about him was wrong. He didn't walk like a man who needed permission. He didn't glance around for validation. He didn't carry the posture of a man hoping to impress. That alone put people on edge. His clothes were simple, functional, deliberate. A dark olive utility jacket, boots that had seen sand and rain alike, a plain crewneck shirt with a faint crease over the chest where a harness had once rested. There were no monograms, no Italian brands, no watch glinting from under the sleeve. And that duffel bag, slung low over his shoulder, looked more like military luggage than luxury. It moved with him like an old companion, scratched and worn, yet unyielding. He walked with purpose, crossing from the rideshare drop-off directly toward the executive access gate, bypassing the luxury terminal entirely. A security agent saw him approach and instinctively moved forward, not in greeting, but interception. Behind mirrored lenses, his eyes scanned quickly clothing, posture, skin tone. Not a single badge. No roll-along suitcase. No assistant. Just one man walking where men like him were never expected to tread. A second guard stepped closer. They shared a glance. The first stepped forward and raised a hand. Not aggressive, just dismissive. It was a gesture Jackson had seen 1,000 times, one used by men who believed they knew everything worth knowing before a word was ever spoken. Jackson stopped calmly, just short of the security line. He didn't protest. He simply opened his jacket and pulled a slim, folded envelope from an inner pocket. It bore no logo, no crest, just paperwork, precise and cold. He held it out without expression. The guard took it with a smirk already forming, ready to glance and hand it back with a scoff. But as he unfolded the documents, something changed. First, his brow tightened. Then his lips moved slightly as he read. He turned the page. Then again. He looked up. Back down. A pause. He called someone. His tone had shifted from authority to uncertainty. From the corner of the terminal's tinted windows, a clerk noticed the interaction. Then another. In such spaces, any break from the smooth rhythm of wealth drew eyes like fire draws wind. Soon, whispers stirred through lounges filled with espresso and entitlement. Someone pulled out a phone. Others began to gather. They didn't know who he was, but they knew what he wasn't. He wasn't them. Within 5 minutes, the operations manager arrived. He jogged, which already told everyone something was off. He wore a blazer too tight for comfort and the strained politeness of someone trying to manage both perception and protocol. He didn't greet Jackson. He went straight to the guard, snatched the papers, and paled. His eyes darted across the fence to the aircraft waiting quietly on the far side of the airstrip. The jet had arrived early. And it wasn't just any jet. Its body, obsidian black, shimmered like onyx beneath the morning sun. The paint caught the light in a way that made it look like liquid metal in motion. The engines sat silent but ready, like lions resting with eyes half closed, needing only a whisper to roar. And on the tail, beside the federal registration code, was a name printed in flawless serif letters. Jackson A. King. No LLC. No parent company. No obfuscation. Just the man's name. In full. People began to notice. The white-haired executive waiting for his charter narrowed his eyes. A woman in pearls who had been laughing with 2 brokers stopped mid-sentence. A teenager in designer sweatpants paused scrolling. Even the pilot prepping his plane on the adjacent pad paused to stare. One of the flight coordinators pointed discreetly, whispering to a uniformed concierge. Across the terminal, it was like a tremor had passed beneath the marble floor. Who was this man? Why hadn't anyone seen him before? Why was his name on a jet they all assumed belonged to someone else? Inside, one assistant asked another who King was. Neither knew, but they started Googling anyway. Back at the gate, the mood had turned brittle. The guard who once blocked Jackson now stood a step behind him, uncertain. The manager extended a hand, offered rushed apologies with his eyes, and radioed to clear a path. A courtesy vehicle was requested. Jackson declined with a brief shake of the head. He walked past the security gate, past the frosted windows filled with silenced voices, past the men who judged and the women who whispered. He walked across the tarmac like it was his own front lawn. Because it was. With every step, the illusion they held about who could own the sky fractured. The hierarchy of appearances, the comfort of assumptions, the invisible fences, they all cracked under the weight of his presence. He wasn't a guest here. He wasn't someone granted access. He had come to collect what was already his. The jet's side door opened before he arrived. The crew inside stood alert, professional, silent. Not because of orders, but respect. The kind of respect earned through history they knew, through leadership they trusted, and through a name they had chosen to follow. Jackson paused before the final steps. He looked once, not at the people behind him, but at the sky in front of him. It was clear, vast, silent, waiting. He climbed aboard without looking back. The inside of the jet was a different kind of silence. Not empty, but intentional. A stillness engineered like a held breath waiting for release. Polished walnut trim lined the walls, contrasting with smooth carbon fiber accents. The floors were layered with matte leather in subtle gray, the lighting soft and indirect, designed not to impress, but to envelop. Every detail had been chosen not to declare wealth, but mastery. A man obsessed with function had curated the space. Jackson moved through the cabin without surprise. This was his creation, every centimeter a reflection of calculated ambition. He placed his duffel carefully in the rear compartment and settled into the command chair behind the co-pilot. His hands ran across the interface, not out of doubt but ritual. Switches, systems, fuel levels, atmospheric diagnostics. His mind operated like a checklist, refined from years of cold mornings in military hangars and last-minute cargo reroutes. The system was green. The jet, fully fueled and cleared, awaited nothing but his final nod. Outside, he could still feel the stares. He didn't look, but he knew. The ones who whispered at the window hadn't left. They needed answers. Needed proof. Their world was built on control through assumption. And someone like him flying past, the control shattered too much. Back in the lounge, questions swirled. Some asked if he was leasing it from someone else. Others theorized a sponsor or silent partner. A woman in a blazer clung to the hope that the name on the jet was a tribute, not ownership. None of them could digest the truth quickly because the truth suggested that their metrics for judgment, their definitions of legitimacy, were broken. But Jackson didn't linger in their disbelief. He signaled for clearance. Moments later, the turbine engines stirred, low and steady, building with the quiet rumble of restrained force. The tarmac shimmered. Heat waves rippled. Mechanics stepped back. Technicians nodded. The runway lights flickered to life as the control tower cleared his path with the kind of respect reserved for certified kings of the sky. Inside the tower, a young air traffic controller adjusted his headset and rechecked the records. There it was again, registration, flight plan, pilot license, ownership, all matched. It was legal. Verified. The man flying the plane owned the plane. It wasn't just hard to process. It was paradigm-breaking. As the engines surged and the wheels began to roll, Jackson's mind didn't dwell on the people watching. He didn't think about the guard's expression or the hollow politeness of the manager who had tried to course-correct too late. He didn't even think about the name painted in gold on the tail. He thought about his father. He remembered grease-stained hands pointing to blueprints taped to cracked garage walls, explaining lift and torque using soda cans and paper. He remembered how they would lay under stripped fuselages, his father tracing airframe curves like a teacher sketching the future. His father never saw luxury. He never walked onto a runway without someone escorting him like a threat. He died of a heart attack on a factory floor, his name never appearing in a single maintenance log, despite being the one who kept those planes flying through winter storms and faulty budgets. Jackson wasn't flying to celebrate his name. He was flying to redeem his father's. The plane lifted. The wheels left the earth and the ground below dropped away. As the city shrank and desert stretched outward, Jackson kept climbing, piercing the layers of heat and cloud until only cold blue remained. At 35,000 feet, the jet cruised silently over the Rockies. Below, cities pulsed. Above, the stratosphere opened wide. He was alone up here, but not empty. His silence was full of memory, full of everything he had carried alone for decades. The missed birthdays. The denied interviews. The insult-laced job rejections. The nights he trained on borrowed simulators, renting hourly access with change saved from ramen dinners. The fear of going bankrupt. The desperation of knowing one wrong calculation could end everything. The betrayal from those he once trusted. And the loneliness of climbing without applause, building without recognition, succeeding in silence. At this altitude, none of that mattered anymore. But still he carried it. He didn't wear a crown, didn't speak in affirmations, didn't bask in validation. What he owned wasn't just an aircraft, it was airspace they said he'd never reach. Ownership was never about possessions for him. It was about sovereignty over limits. It was a declaration that he could cross barriers, geographic, economic, racial, not because they allowed him, but because he refused to remain grounded. When he landed hours later on the coast, the reception was different. At the private landing strip in Monterey, the ground crew stood in quiet readiness. They had seen his flight manifest. The tail was unmistakable. No one questioned his stride this time. No one blocked his path. No one checked for credentials. They knew. A luxury sedan waited beyond the tarmac, arranged by his assistant, an assistant who had never seen him raise his voice, but always arrived 10 minutes early because he'd taught her that in aviation, time was currency. He stepped out of the cockpit and into the stillness of coastal air. The jet behind him gleamed under the late afternoon sun, casting a long shadow across the tarmac. His name caught the light, sharp and irrefutable. No press. No cameras. But the statement had already been made. Because the people who needed to know already knew. The man who didn't look like he belonged had just redrawn the map of who belonged anywhere. The next morning began with mist bleeding over the hills of the Pacific coast, the ocean dragging long fingers of salt across the low airstrip. The jet rested under a canvas of silver cloud, its matte black skin beaded with dew, as still and confident as the man who had piloted it. Jackson was already awake, long before the city shook off its dreams. In a rented workspace atop a converted warehouse near the marina, he stood alone, his reflection staring back at him from the tall window as he reviewed the blueprints spread across a long oak table. Behind him, 3 screens displayed maps, cargo routes, asset reports, and projected fuel consumption metrics for the month ahead. He wasn't here for leisure. He never was. The warehouse belonged to a logistics think tank that had dismissed him 4 years earlier without a meeting, citing fit. Now he leased the entire top floor under a new corporate shell, and no one had connected the name yet. It didn't matter. Jackson didn't chase recognition. He pursued control. Not out of ego, but necessity. When control was denied to you long enough, reclaiming it became survival. By noon, he was in a tailored, understated suit, charcoal gray, no tie, shoes shined just enough to suggest polish, not performance. His assistant handed him the agenda. He scanned it once, nodded, and walked toward the elevator. On the ride down, he didn't rehearse. He didn't need to. This was a meeting he had earned through flight hours, failures, and financial accuracy, not charm or legacy. The boardroom he entered was stark, aggressively modern, glass, steel, the scent of filtered air and calculated lighting. Around the table sat 7 people, 5 men and 2 women, all dressed in the soft armor of corporate confidence. They represented a venture capital firm known for acquisitions with aggressive exit strategies. Jackson was here not to ask for their money but to acquire one of their fractured holdings, a regional carrier on the edge of collapse. They underestimated him instantly. The lead partner leaned back, adjusting his cufflink with the practiced indifference of a man who never had to fight for entry. Jackson noticed. The others offered tight nods and scanned him not with curiosity but assessment, trying to find the flaw, the overreach. His assistant handed them the pitch deck. Jackson didn't wait. He spoke only once at the start, then let the numbers do the talking. His proposal wasn't flashy. It was surgical. He didn't promise disruption. He presented inevitability. Profit margins, restructured fuel contracts, military-grade maintenance protocols adapted for civilian use, optimized flight logistics from a proprietary algorithm developed in-house. All of it was lean, tested, and coldly efficient. His operation had outperformed 3 established players in 3 quarters. He didn't gloat. He explained. He didn't ask for faith. He provided data. Still, he watched them fight the reality of him. They didn't see a CEO. Not at first. They saw a pilot, a technician, a former enlisted man walking into their space as if he belonged. Their discomfort was subtle, paper-thin smiles, offhand remarks about boots on the ground, experience, a forced chuckle at a misread joke. Jackson stayed still, like a predator that had already eaten. Then, midway through the meeting, it happened. One partner asked who the real executive was behind the curtain, who was really funding the expansion. The room stilled. His assistant didn't flinch. Jackson said nothing, simply reached into the file and slid across one more document: ownership breakdown, capital stack, and controlling interests. Every percentage led back to him. Silence fell heavier than shame. The man blinked, nodded slowly, and never looked at him the same again. He'd seen that look before. It was the look of a man realizing his assumptions had made him blind. By the time the meeting ended, Jackson had what he came for: a signature, a price cut, and 2 non-disclosure agreements. Not because he begged, but because leverage speaks louder than perception when wielded correctly. That evening, back on the tarmac, his jet waited again. He didn't rush. He walked across the tarmac like someone reclaiming sacred land. The ground crew greeted him with subtle nods. One technician, young and sharp-eyed, lingered just long enough to ask with his eyes what his lips didn't dare. Jackson paused, nodded once, and the kid lit up behind the visor. Even without a word, Jackson had spoken. He had spoken for every underestimated dreamer, every discarded resume, every "you don't belong here" that echoed in stairwells and reception desks. At altitude again, the stars outside his window flickered. Inside, Jackson reviewed the incoming messages. A fund in Singapore was asking to meet. A fleet contract from South Africa was flagged as urgent. The numbers were strong. Growth was accelerating. But more importantly, the narrative was beginning to shift. A journalist had seen the tail number. She connected the dots. An article had appeared quietly online. The man whose name is on the jet. It wasn't viral. Not yet. But the truth had a way of surviving even when silenced. Jackson turned off the screen and looked out the window, the lights below stretching across the earth like a circuitry board. He wasn't done. Not even close. He didn't want fame. He wanted fracture. Fracture of the belief that ownership looked like privilege. Fracture of the illusion that legacy could not be rewritten by will. Fracture of the invisible ceilings still polished and intact in corner offices and airports worldwide. And crack by crack, the glass was breaking. It was never about one jet. Not really. That sleek machine with his name engraved below the tail was just a vessel. A symbol forged from steel, money, and silence. What it carried wasn't just cargo or passengers. It carried something far heavier. The weight of erasure, the memory of rejection, the history of being told to wait outside. Jackson's empire was expanding, but quietly. He didn't send press releases. He sent bids. He didn't go to networking events. He acquired their hosts. One by one, companies on the brink, mismanaged, misunderstood, or simply ignored, began folding under his control. But he didn't strip them for parts. He rebuilt. He retrained. He rewired operations like he once rewired engines. Intimately, methodically, precisely. In Atlanta, he walked the floor of a hangar they had called unrecoverable. Rusted scaffolding, broken floor jacks, loose wiring. Everyone had written it off. Jackson didn't flinch. He hired veterans who'd been pushed out for being overqualified. He replaced an entire department with ex-mechanics who'd been laid off in mergers. Within 6 months, the facility passed FAA audit with the highest score in the region. In Detroit, he sat in a back room with union leaders who hadn't been taken seriously in decades. He spoke their language, not out of charm but fluency. He'd worked that floor, knew the difference between heat that cooks metal and heat that breaks spirits. He didn't ask for loyalty. He earned it. By the third quarter, his new logistics hub was processing nearly 30% of East Coast air freight for critical medical deliveries. The name J.A. King Aviation Logistics began appearing in shipping manifests that once read like a billionaire's phone book. But for every executive who shook his hand, there were 10 more who blinked in disbelief when he walked into the room. He still wore the same watchless wrist, still carried that duffel when flying commercial for low-profile meetings, still preferred silence over performance. The media began catching up. Slowly. A podcast interview here, a headline buried behind IPOs there. But none of them could quite frame the story. They wanted the rags to riches myth. He gave them spreadsheets. They wanted dramatic quotes. He offered numbers. They wanted anger. He gave them structure. One magazine cover never went to print. The editor admitted, off record, that their advertisers found the image jarring. A black man stepping off a jet? The headline reading, he didn't ask. He took flight. It was too much. Too sharp. Too real. He let them kill it. And then acquired their struggling aviation vertical 3 months later through a shell holding. By the time winter rolled in, his operation had scaled across 5 time zones. Pilots who once worked for him now ran teams. Engineers he trained were developing custom modifications under his R&D division. Clients who once scoffed now signed exclusivity deals. But even with the empire rising, Jackson remained untouched by the spectacle of it. He didn't move into a mansion. He bought land and built a hangar house hybrid outside Santa Fe where sky stretched forever and silence was sacred. The ceilings were high enough to walk a small jet through. The windows faced east toward sunrise, toward beginnings. Inside that space, he kept 2 things on a shelf. One was the old model jet his father gave him, with wings bent from time and fingerprints permanently etched in plastic. The other was the military badge of a friend who never made it back from the final mission they flew together. Both reminded him that success was a fragile runway, always one misstep away from fracture. His past, however, had not been buried. It had been watching. The bank that denied him a $40,000 loan 5 years ago sent a private invite to speak at their entrepreneur summit. He declined and instead wired a contribution to a scholarship fund for displaced veterans from the same city under one condition: the award letter had to include a single sentence from the man they thought couldn't own a jet. At another summit, a luxury aviation company he once tried to intern with now pitched him an acquisition offer, desperate to shed their debt. Their CEO didn't recognize him until the final page of the meeting deck, when his name appeared as primary shareholder of their 3 largest competitors. The silence that followed was something Jackson had learned to measure like altitude. You always knew how high you were by how quiet the air became. Still, he kept moving. Expansion was never the end. Justice was. He created internship programs for kids from zip codes like the one he grew up in. No GPA filters. No golf club referrals. Just aptitude, grit, and hunger. He sat in on their first interviews personally, often without them knowing who he was. Some arrived nervous, some skeptical. One asked if he was the mechanic. He smiled. He liked the ones who didn't assume. He launched a nonprofit wing, Flight Path, that trained ex-felons in aeronautical maintenance and engineering certifications. His board tried to dissuade him. He funded it anyway. Within a year, 30% of his maintenance workforce had been certified through that pipeline and none had reoffended. He measured success not in second chances, but in third flights. It wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about creating space where others no longer had to fight for it. Every time a young man or woman stepped into a jet with their name stitched into a jumpsuit or printed on a crew tag, Jackson felt the ledger shift, not financially, but spiritually. The years of silence, of denial, of watching from behind fences, they were being paid forward, one boarding ramp at a time. He still flew his jet personally once a week. Not for image. For reminder. The tail still bore his name. Not to prove he owned it, but to remind the world that someone like him was never meant to. And yet he did. The call came at dawn, brief, clipped, urgent. A fog advisory grounded most private departures along the eastern seaboard. Several chartered flights were delayed. Executives barked into phones from lounges built to silence them. A storm was sweeping westward and across multiple terminals. Even the most confident pilots were holding for updates. But at a small airstrip in Pennsylvania, one jet had clearance. And only one man was striding through the pre-dawn mist with calm, unhurried footsteps. Jackson moved through the shadows like someone who had been here before. He didn't react to delays. He didn't check his watch. His flight plan was filed hours earlier, manually. No assistant. No entourage. Just a checklist etched into his memory and hands that had known both engines and loss. As the horizon began to crack with pale orange, he looked out over the fog-draped runway like a man surveying something he'd once been denied. The plane waited quietly, low to the ground and black as the sky behind it. Ground crew nodded without words. No one questioned him. No one asked for identification. They had learned. The man who once stood outside fences now walked inside them like a silent architect reclaiming his space. He climbed aboard. This flight wasn't for business. It wasn't for publicity. It wasn't even strategic. It was personal. At 35,000 feet, alone in the air, he replayed the voice message that had arrived just before sleep the night before. A woman. Soft. Familiar. Her voice had aged, but her tone hadn't. It was his mother. She'd heard a rumor. That his name was on the side of a jet. That people were saying it out loud. That someone from the neighborhood had seen an article. She was crying, though she tried to hide it. Not because of the jet, but because someone had finally said his name and said it with reverence. For decades, she had watched her son vanish into fatigue, into flights she didn't understand, into nights where he didn't call because he couldn't afford the shame of explaining how close everything was to falling apart. She had heard him dismissed in job interviews while waiting outside in the car. She had folded his rejection letters and tucked them into drawers like they were something to be kept safe. She'd never seen his name in gold. Now she had. Jackson stared at the clouds outside the window, thinking about what the sky had once felt like, foreign, ungraspable, reserved for other names, other faces. He thought of every time he had stared up from the streets as a child and wondered why it all seemed unreachable. He thought about his brother, the one who didn't make it past 23. About the hospital bills. The mistreatments. The GoFundMe campaign that failed. He had once promised himself if he ever succeeded it would be a reply to that failure. He had kept that promise tenfold. He funded medical airlifts for low-income families now. Quietly. No branding. No social media. Just a phone number that only hospital administrators had. Every time the jet touched down to deliver a child who couldn't wait for traffic, he knew his brother would have understood. The jet began to descend over St. Louis. Below, a high school was preparing a career day. The principal was unaware of who was landing. He only knew that a major donor had offered to cover aviation training scholarships for all seniors with interest. Jackson had planned to walk into the auditorium with the others quietly, anonymously, but his arrival hadn't gone unnoticed. A janitor at the school had been a veteran. He had served with Jackson long ago. And when he saw the man step out of the aircraft that now bore the name King Aviation, he dropped the mop and stood still. By the time Jackson entered the hall, word had spread. Students buzzed. Teachers whispered. Some Googled him. Others stared. He didn't flinch. He took a seat in the back row. No podium. No spotlight. Just another set of eyes watching the kids walk past their own ceilings. At the end of the program, when the scholarship was announced, one student stood frozen in place. A girl no older than 16. Braids, scuffed shoes, tired eyes. She mouthed the name written on the certificate, then turned toward the man in the back. Her voice was too soft to hear. But her tears weren't. Afterward, she approached. He didn't introduce himself. She didn't ask for proof. She simply handed him a folded paper. A blueprint she'd drawn, rough, hand-measured, creased from being carried too long. A plain design. Not perfect, but sincere. She said she wanted to be an engineer. She said no one believed her. He nodded once and took the paper. He flew back that night without fanfare. The world below was shifting, but slowly. There were still boardrooms where he was underestimated. Still emails that addressed him as Mr. Jackson because they assumed he wasn't the king in the logo. Still invitations sent to proxies instead of him. He didn't mind. Every slight was now recycled into opportunity for someone else. In his hangar home back in Santa Fe, he walked past the old shelf. The model plane. The badge. And now a new addition. A hand-drawn blueprint of a teenage girl's dream. He framed it. Not as decoration, but as a reminder. This wasn't the summit. It was a waypoint. He stood outside and looked at the stars. The wind pressed gently against him, carrying the silence of altitude. In the distance, the blinking lights of another jet crossed the sky, high and quiet. He didn't need to chase it. His name was already flying.